leaders have benefited from Martinelli's practical, results-oriented training and consultation. Frank is also the author of Encouraging Your Visionary Board Leadership, which appeared in You and Your Nonprofit Board, Advice and Practical Tips from the field's top practitioners, researchers, and provocateurs, published by Charity Channel Press. First line of that book, or that chapter, are you interested in building an active and strategically oriented board of directors? You are not alone. I hope that's what you came here to learn today. I know that Frank will present a lot of great strategies for you, and so please join me in welcoming Mr. Martinelli.
Thanks, Karen. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Well, Karen led us off with the right question. Are you thinking about who your replacements will be? And that's especially a question for people my age, but it's not just for people my age. It's for people that have been in a board for a while, and we need to keep on providing service and support to the organization. The mission is really vital. And in the same breath, we need to make room for other leaders. They're out there. We just have to set things up so that it's a little easier to find them. That and philosophy that we heard yesterday versus the but. All right, so board succession planning, is, as Karen mentioned, is one of the most important responsibilities of boards of directors, but most boards don't do it. Yet it's key to igniting progress in your association and in the sport. And my purpose really is to provide some tools and techniques that will help you, if you're not already doing it, begin to develop a board succession plan for your association. Our ability to answer these questions, or rather our inability to answer questions like this, reveal the importance of board succession planning. How would we carry out our responsibilities if a key board leader suddenly became vacant? Do we select people for leadership positions based on likability and who knows who? Or do we think about what are the needs, especially what are the future needs of our association, and where can we begin talking to people that can help us meet those future needs? Do we know today who will replace current board leaders when their terms end? And I pose that question knowing that there are plenty of organizations in this country that don't have term limits. We'll talk a little bit later about why it's a good idea. And then finally, do current board leaders feel they have benefited in a meaningful way from their board service? It's a real important question to ask ourselves and also to ask them, so that as they move on, whatever insights, whatever information they can give us about what it was like when they were on the board can really provide some good guidance for us as we look for future leaders. So here's a definition of board leadership succession planning. It's from a national nonprofit called the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM for short. Some of you may be familiar with that organization. So here it is. Succession planning is the use of a planned program to ensure that new high-performing leaders are developed to successfully replace board leaders whenever needed to carry out the mission, vision, and goals of your association. So it's doing some things to have a steady, dependable supply of the next generation of great leaders. We know we've got great leaders now. We want to make sure that we've got them in the future. So it's a plan for developing future board leadership, but I think succession planning can also be a way to help the people that are currently on the board be everything that they can be as a leader. So it's leadership development of those of us that are on the board, not just the next generation. We've already talked about it as a critical board responsibility. It has a connection to the strategic plan, and I know that that was something that Richard and Mike really stressed yesterday in the board orientation session, so we'll double back and make some comments about the strategic plan. And then in general, it's linked to board recruitment and training processes. It's more than just recruitment, but it's linked very closely to recruitment. In your hands, hopefully you got a copy of it when you came in. I'd like you to take a look at this. I call it the life cycle of a board leader, and it's a model that I'm going to be referring to a few times during the presentation today. The main message in this model, it's really a model for board leader succession planning. The main message is we've got to start doing more thinking about before people come onto the board and when people leave the board. Sometimes I think we create a little bit of a trap. It's a version of that but response. We focus only on the people that are currently on the board of directors. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of us operate with a scarcity mentality. My God, if any of the current board left, what would we do? There's nobody else. Well, there are plenty of other people out there. This model, the life cycle, begins to give us some ideas about how to build that supply. So it's really a framework for board succession planning. And up at the top, there's a paragraph in very, very small type. I know I wouldn't be able to read it without my glasses, but it talks about this model first of all, as a comprehensive leadership development process. It's building a feeder system for the team, so to speak. The Farm League, a variety of involvement options, and especially if you look over on the left side, the before board service, just talking about committees, work groups, task forces, events, tournaments, all the different things that are important to put our mission out there. These are the early places where that next generation of leaders can lead. And so the use of standing and ad hoc committee structures, task forces, work groups as the leadership training school for the association. That's really the way you need to look at it. And then eventually some of those individuals are going to decide to serve on the board, or we're going to raise the question first because we've had our eye on them for a while. What a leader. It would be great if we could get this person onto our board of directors. Sometimes they come up with a bright idea, and we help them along. And then I want to make a few comments about life after the board. Over on the right side of the graphic, again, that scarcity mentality. We hold on for dear life because we're afraid if we let someone leave the board, they'll leave town. And in fact, they'll leave the planet. We'll never see them again. And it's really sort of a similar approach. We've got to make sure that there continue to be involvement options that are suitable for people that have been on the board for a while. They've provided years of great leadership and service, and they've got more to give us. Yesterday, Richard and Mike talked about building into the orientation process a way of pairing people up, new board leaders, with folks that have been around for a while. Call it a mentorship system, call it a buddy system. So I think that those folks that move off the board, either because they've decided they want to or term limits require it, there's still some leadership gas in their tank. So in the definition that we looked at a moment ago, there was a phrase in yellow highlight, high performing. What I'd like to do, because it is a key idea, a key concept, what I'd like to do is just build it out a bit. And I'm going to try to build it out by referring to two models of governance. There are a lot of models of board governance out there. There are a couple that have really turned my head, and I'd like to share them with you. The Visionary Board leadership model, in fact, maybe it turned my head because I wrote the article. It's the one that Karen referred to a moment ago. But it answers the question, what do we mean by high performing from the perspective of who are we looking for? What kind of mindset, how do people look at things, look at organizations? These are really those and folks that we were talking about yesterday. So it goes something like this. First of all, we look for people that bring some of the following mindsets to the board. And I'm not suggesting that every person we look at for board service has all 8 of these qualities. We'll be happy if they bring one of them. The first, visionary and future focused. Karen alluded to that in her introduction, and I think I may have said a few things already that suggest we are looking for people to do the work, and people that are also really, to some degree, focused on the future. They're thinking about what comes next. Not what happened yesterday or before today's board meeting, but what's coming next for our association, for the sport. Entrepreneurial spirit. We're a nonprofit association, but entrepreneurial spirit means that some of the board understands, and I think a lot of you know this, certainly, before I say it, we operate in a competitive marketplace. We're not the only game in town. Literally, we're not the only game in town. And so we have to really be on our toes. We have to be providing services and programs that really meet the needs of people out there. And entrepreneurial spirit means that we know that if we don't meet those needs, and if we don't stay on top of changing needs, those individuals are not going to be coming to us in the future. They're going to go someplace else to get their needs met. Risk takers, this is a hard one, because the popular wisdom about boards of directors is we're thoughtful, prudent people. We don't take big chances. We don't make big mistakes that will cost the association money. And all of that is true, sometimes referred to as the stewardship responsibility of being on a board of directors. But stuff is changing so rapidly that we have to be open to trying new things. That's one of the reasons why we want some new people on the board. And new things come with risk. So we don't want to be foolish, but we need to be prepared to take some reasonable risks. And so balancing the need to be the wise stewards and also take some risks from time to time, that's a hard thing to balance. I don't have any easy answer, but we have to figure out how to do both. Strategic decision makers, again, I think we've begun to build that theme. We're looking for folks that understand that if I'm on the board of an association, I'm going to make all sorts of decisions with my fellow board members. Some of those decisions are going to be strategic decisions. How do we position ourselves for the future? What services and programs are we going to offer in the future? Effective communicators, it goes without saying, and I think certainly the workshop yesterday afternoon was just really highlighted the importance of being effective communicators. In the times we live in, being an effective communicator means that we are effective with good old-fashioned face-to-face. We have coffee with each other, we talk about stuff. It also means that we have some minimal capability or competency in using some of the online communication tools. I mean, we'd be surprised if someone said, you know, I'm sorry, I don't have a telephone, so if you want to get together and talk about something, we'll have to schedule something. So effective communicators, in all of the different ways we're able to communicate with each other, with bowlers, with staff, with other stakeholders and supporters. Systems thinkers. The shorthand here is that as members of the board, we understand that one of the important things we do is we solve problems. We deal with issues. And systems thinking means that before we come up with a solution, we have a pretty good idea of what the root causes of the problem are. So that, you know, the image of an iceberg, for example. There's a little bit of the iceberg above the water. There's most of the iceberg below the water. And I think sometimes in our problem solving, we focus on what's above the water. We are sort of oblivious to all of the rest of the iceberg. We have to be systems thinkers. We have to really be clear about what the problem is before we come up with a solution. And then partnerships and alliance builders, we usually count on our paid staff to do some of that, in fact, to do a lot of it. But I think being on a board, we need some people that really understand partnerships and alliances, and at a higher board level, they're doing that thinking. For our association to be successful now and into the future, who and what do we have to be building strong alliances with? And then finally, the last quality or characteristic is diversity. And I think a lot of times, and for all the right reasons, we talk about diversity in terms of race and ethnicity and national background, and we need to do that. That's important, and at the same time, I'm holding out for a broader definition. So we need to be diverse as a reflection of our mission and our values and our vision and our goals. So race and ethnicity, age, we need younger people on our boards, and by young, I don't mean under 50. That doesn't sound too young to me. Well, actually, it does because of the age that I am, but you know what I'm saying. Geographic diversity. If we're an association that represents the interests of a wider geographic area, it's got to be more than 1 or 2 zip codes. So we're looking for these things when we talk about high-performing board members for the future. And again, my point at the beginning, we don't all individually have to bring all 8 of these things, but collectively, we've got the bases covered. That's really where we're going. Another way of thinking about high-performing comes from another model of governance. Governance as leadership. And I'll mention that some of the things that I'm talking about, there is more information in the resource manual that you'll find on the ARC. So more information if you care to look. This is a model that came out of a book by the same name. It was published maybe 10, 12 years ago. It's really important because it goes beyond most of the other models of board governance that are out there. And I'll show you what I mean. This graphic, first of all, you can see that the word generative, that's one of the 3 modes of governance: strategic mode, generative mode, and fiduciary mode in terms of the ways that boards govern effectively. I will emphasize generative mode a bit in the next couple of minutes because for a lot of us, that's the missing piece. So it goes something like this. The first mode is the fiduciary mode. And this is really, in a way, it captures the traditional sense of what the board is supposed to do. Minding the store, being concerned about the financial condition of the association. And you can see some of the questions that are there on the slide. These are questions that boards want to have answers to. And when they're working in these areas, those are all examples of fiduciary mode governance. The authors use the word sentinel to really capture what the fiduciary mode is all about. The watchdog, minding the store, making sure that nothing big is out of place. When we're in fiduciary mode, some of the activities, some of the things that the board does, we oversee operations. We don't micromanage operations, but we oversee them. We ensure effective and efficient use of resources. We make sure that we're in legal compliance with applicable laws and regulations that govern our association and nonprofits in general. We monitor organizational results. So that's fiduciary mode. The board is sentinel. The second mode, and the first word is the tip-off, the strategic mode. And in this mode, the board is operating as strategists, usually in partnership, in collaboration with key association staff. So we're setting strategy for the next 2, 3, 4 years. And again, you can see a couple of questions that are there on the slide. The board is thinking about these kinds of things. We know what we've been doing for the last 50 years. What should we be doing in the future? Should we be doing some of the things that we've done differently? Where are we going? What's our strategic direction as an association? And then what's the plan, as in what's the strategic plan? Again, hearkening back to the board orientation session that Richard and Mike did yesterday, a number of references to the strategic plan. The authors say that we're still not done, that there's one more mode. They call it generative mode. So beyond the reach of the strategic plan, and when we're doing strategic planning, usually it's the next 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years out. So it's future, but it's not 100 years out. It's not 20 years out. Generative mode, and again, the authors use the expression, the board as sense maker, is when out beyond the strategic plan, our sense is that there is something new bubbling up, and we're not sure what it is. There might be some signs that we've been able to track. We know something different is coming, but we haven't been able to figure it out yet. Think of the image of something around the bend. Something around the bend, it'll be here before we know it. It always arrives sooner rather than later. But because it's around the bend, we can't see it clearly. And that's why the authors talk about the board as sense maker. Let me give you a couple of examples. For libraries, for public libraries, but libraries in general, 30 years ago, there was this new thing around the bend, and librarians knew something was up, library leaders knew something was up, but they weren't quite sure. They were hearing things about something called the internet, something called the World Wide Web. And the initial reaction, and I know this because I've had an opportunity to do some strategic planning, some future planning with public libraries. I live in Milwaukee, so that's the library system I'm talking about. And it's like those old vampire movies where people would be going like this to keep the vampire away. That's the stance that librarians had, at least early on, to technology. This is new, this is different. This has no place in libraries. What the heck is going on? Now, to their credit, even though the phrase generative governance wasn't being used back then, they were doing generative governance. They were making sense out of something that was totally new. It was a game changer. And you can see the evidence. You go into a library today, there are still books, although there are some libraries that don't have books, but they're technology-rich environments. And librarians still help us find the book we're looking for, but they also guide us to finding things online. Their role has really changed. So that, to me, is a good example of something around the bend that required generative thinking. For organizations, both nonprofit and public sector, that work with persons with disabilities, I would say that the new thing around the bend that they need to figure out is autonomous vehicle technology, self-driving cars. Because best case, that technology is going to be a godsend for people that are limited in terms of their mobility. But it's so new, it's so different, that the leaders of those organizations have to figure out what exactly does that mean in terms of the programs and services that we offer right now. If they're not careful, Uber or Lyft will be the next disability mobility organization, if you get my drift. But it also suggests that, and not but, that it also suggests that under the right conditions, maybe an organization like that should be developing some strategic partnerships with ride-sharing companies like Lyft and Uber. And then certainly for your world, for the sport of bowling and for associations like yours, the thing around the bend was, and I think it continues to be, the online world, virtual reality, all the different ways that people can be entertained. And it's not dire. I think that other speakers I've heard since I've been here have talked about some of the great opportunities in all of that, and you're already moving in that direction. You may not know it, but some of your work has really been generative mode. And then finally, the authors assert that a great board has got to be all three. So I'm mentioning this because this model helps us do some thinking about when we're looking for that next generation of leadership, what should we be looking for? So we're looking for people that have those future-focused mindsets that we started with. We're looking for people that come to us with the ability to operate, to think, and to govern in these three modes. Here's another way of looking at the three modes, these three columns, one for each. And then in each of the columns, you can see some typical responsibilities. This chart is also on the ARC. You'll find it there if you haven't seen it already. But again, when, the point to be made here, when we're looking for that next generation of leaders, when we're beginning to gear up for succession planning, recruitment, and all of the other activities, these are the things that we're looking for. We need people that bring all three of these skill sets to us. And by the way, those of us that are on the board also need them, and many of them we have already. So, we've talked about high performing, the definition, what we're looking for. What I'd like to do before we get into the tools is talk about some, I call them enablers, some things that need to be in place in the association and in the board. It sets the stage for doing the kind of board leader succession planning that we're called to do. So it's really about building internal capacity. There are 4 of them. I'm going to just list them real quickly, and then we'll take a look at each of them separately. We need a board committee. Sometimes it's called the governance committee. Sometimes it's called the board leadership committee or nominations committee. We need a committee to guide this important work. It's too big and important to just leave off to the side. It deserves its own committee. Secondly, we need to start thinking of board development as a leadership development process. Recruitment is the starting point, but there are a number of other steps in this process of developing great leaders. Thirdly, we need to make sure that we've clearly defined the roles of board, volunteers, committees, and our association staff. And then finally, recruitment and training aligned with your strategic plan. So again, we're talking about the strategic plan. It's central to so much of what we do as organizations. So let's take a look at each one of these. The governance committee leading the effort. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it's known by other names, the nominating, the legislative, the education and training committee. It may already be there. And even if it hasn't been involved in thinking about leadership succession up to this point, they're going to have to, or we're going to have to create another committee to do it. And you can see from some of the bullet points, once again, all of this material is on the ARC. You can see from the bullet points that it mentions recruitment, but it mentions a number of other things. Board education, assessing the board, annually reviewing our governance, our board structures to make sure that they're working for us, and if they're not, to offer some recommendations for changes. So that's the first thing. And again, I want to stress that this committee is doing more than recruitment. The second, leadership development, really looking at it as a process. And the subtitle on this slide, Building Leaderful Associations, I wish I could claim that poetry. It's from the work of a writer and organizational theorist named Margaret or Meg Wheatley. She talked about we need to figure out how we can build leaderful organizations, organizations that are just teeming with leadership in different stages of development. My opportunity to hang out yesterday in some of the workshops and early evening tells me that this is a leaderful organization already, but going back to Karen's question at the beginning, have we thought about who the replacements are? So Here's a graphic that just suggests it's more than just recruitment, more than just filling vacancies. Orientation, ongoing training, evaluation, and recognition. Let's look at each one of them. So recruitment, we're familiar with that. Scouting, talent, we're looking for that next generation of leaders. And again, I want to stress that we're doing more than filling a couple of vacancies this year. We're really thinking about the next couple of years. Orientation and onboarding, we'll talk more about that. Again, that's something that Richard and Mike covered really well yesterday. Ongoing training, once people are on the board, there is a need to make sure that new board members and the rest of us are getting all of the training and support that they may need. Some kind of regular review. Again, there are some great resources on the ARC for this, board and association, evaluation, and review. And recognition, it's listed as the last thing, but obviously it's something that needs to be done on an ongoing basis. Formal recognition, informal recognition. So as we approach leadership succession planning, we need to be thinking of this broader notion of leadership development with all of these steps or stages. The third, clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Some of the points that come into play. We have to have, first of all, as we're thinking about bringing that next generation on, we have to have clarity about the management function and the governance function. We're talking about the governing board of the association. We're talking about some of those higher level decisions and responsibilities that the governing board of an association has. And we don't micromanage. We don't get in the way of our paid professional association staff. So clarity about that. Agreement in terms of policy and oversight functions. We talked earlier of the three modes of governance model, the board as sentinel or watchdog. We want to make sure that we're clear about what the bounds of that are. It's important that we have written individual board and committee descriptions, volunteer descriptions that are current. These are some of the tools that we're going to be using as we talk about new and prospective board members about what they may be getting themselves into. And then also to ensure that the association manager job description is current as well. So clarity about how we define roles and responsibilities. Here's an example of a board member job description. There are more examples on the ARC. But as you look at some of these items that are listed here, I think most of us would love a board member that did most of these. These are some of the typical expectations. What's missing from this list, but is certainly on the list of job descriptions for many associations and boards of other nonprofits, some responsibility for fundraising. If in fact that is one of the expectations, that has to be included as well. And then recruitment aligned with your strategic plan. And let me just underscore the point that we're looking to build a leadership talent pipeline. So it's not filling vacancies in 2018. Well, maybe a little bit of that, but it's also thinking about who are the new leaders that we'll bring on over the next several years. And that's the time frame of our strategic plan. Couple of steps. We need to, first of all, review the strategic plan. The example of the organization-wide strategic plan that Richard and Mike were talking about yesterday, and then your local association version of that. So review that. That's really the reference point. And then based on the strategic plan, begin to really talk with each other about the skills, the knowledge, the connections, the networks that are needed by the board to, in a sense, hold up its end. We know that some elements of the strategic plan implementation will be the responsibility of association staff, and we also know that some of it is going to be our responsibility as board leaders. So to begin thinking in terms of what skills, what knowledge, and what relationships. And this connection to the strategic plan. We come off of a strategic planning process, and sometimes we've made some real direction-setting changes and decisions. We've never done this before, we're going to try this in the future. And whenever we're thinking about something new, that's going to be suggestive of some new skills that future board leaders need, some new knowledge, some new connections in our service area. And then all of this leads to setting clear multi-year strategic recruiting priorities. That's quite a mouthful, but again, one more time to make the point, we're not just filling a few vacancies this year. We're developing a plan to fill ongoing vacancies as they come about over the next several years. So here's our definition again. I'm going to pause for just a second. I know that we've covered a lot of ground. With respect to those enablers that I talked about, with respect to the definition of high-performing boards through the lens of that profile of future leadership, and then also the 3 modes of governance, and also the life cycle of a board leader, which you have in hand. Are there any questions before we move on? Any questions or any comments? Yes.
Here we go. Thank you. I was going to have to come up with my own question for him.
I don't know if it's a question, but our board is probably the likability board. And our nominating committee, it's kind of strange because I'm kind of new to the board, but the nominating committee gets picked like right before we need a board member. And then, I mean, it's not like it's a committee for, like, I like that idea that committee is a committee. Yeah. It's really not a committee. It's like a, who do you know that we could put on the board?
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, you know, that's the reality. And again, not just in your associations, but throughout the nonprofit world, if you will, that we've just gotten used to doing that as an ad hoc activity. And sometimes it's even enshrined in the bylaws. There might be some language that says something like, in the fall of the year, the president will appoint 3 people as the nominating committee. They come up with a slate, and then they disappear until next year when the president does it again.
When they pick a new people to do it, because it's really hard at the last minute to say, hey, could you be on this committee and pick somebody because we need a board member?
Yeah.
Which is what happens.
Yeah, and easier said than done, but we've got to get out of that mode.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is great.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Any other comments? There's one in the back.
Got one here, and then I'll come to that.
Do you have any recommendations for helping a stagnant board that's had a consistency of members for a long time? You know, how to help those discussions with, you know, moving forward and trying to identify additional resources that may be able to step in on the next steps?
The geographic spread of the service area, it's driven by the size of the committee structure. And then I think especially for many of you, you're in this period merger. I've heard that word a million times. These are challenging times for your organizations. And so maybe you need boards, especially if the merger means we're providing service to a much broader area, and that's what it means, doesn't it? Most of the time, that maybe we've got to be more than 10 people in the future. Yes?
When I was looking at your plan earlier, you had before the board. And this is one thing that I have. I've been on our board for, I think, 8 or 9 years. And I've constantly think that we should think before the board. And we're board members, and we have committees, and it's always the board members on the committees. We never reach outside. And I do think it's a good plan to reach outside, get somebody that's not a board member on our committee to work with us on certain things, and eventually they may become a board member, and that's how you build them. But it's hard to get our board to do that. How do you advise to go to your board meeting and say, we need to reach outside?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's pretty hard to do this leadership succession process the way we're talking about it if the board committees are, in a sense, closed systems. And sometimes, for some of us, it might mean that we need to adjust the bylaws. If the bylaws say you got to be a board member to be on a board standing committee, we've got to deal with that. That's a change that has to be made. In many cases, there isn't that prohibition. I think you just make a really compelling argument that if we're going to assure that we have that next generation, we've got to open things up. You know, there might be a few committees that we decide board members only. A finance committee comes to mind. But most of the other committees, why not open it up? We've got time for one more question, at least at this point.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you have any suggestions on like a small local association, one center in the area. What do you do when your board is comprised mainly of the proprietor's family and friends? Give me something that works, please.
We didn't say they were going to be easy, Frank.
Yeah, I know, and that is a real hard one. You know, well, I'm going to repeat at least part of what I said before, that you can't make these changes without people taking leadership. And so right now, if you've got, let's call it a closed system, I'm sure they're wonderful people, but it's a closed system, and I'll bet it's pretty hard to get into that. I'm just thinking that sometimes, again, talking with people who, in this case, may not be on the board, but they have some influence on the board, personal relationships, things of that nature, to begin talking about, and again, armed with some of the tools that we've begun to discuss here and some of the other things I'm going to share with you, that we need a plan for the next generation of leaders. And we are not going to survive as an organization if we continue with that closed system. And if you can't find anybody to talk to, I would be at a loss. I probably don't have to tell you, stuff like this doesn't happen without leaders taking the lead.
Frank? I'm back here. I just would suggest that your regional manager, and they may be able to also connect you with some of the BPAA board members that might be able to give you some strategies. No. I think those tough conversations and figuring out how to shape those.
Yeah. If you want to commiserate a little bit, I'm going to be around after the session. We can talk. All right, so let's get into it. Let's start talking about some of the tools. There are several, and we've already begun to touch on a few of them. The strategic plan, I can't overemphasize the importance of using the strategic plan as inspiration for succession planning, for building that future generation board. The strategic plan really describes where we're going over the next couple of years, and as one of the earlier slides suggested, looking at where we're going over the next several years, our strategic priorities, begins to generate some early ideas about what kinds of board leaders will we need in the future. To the degree that the strategic plan challenges us to do things that we haven't done before, we're going to need some new things on the board, expressed as skills, expressed as knowledge and information, expressed as networks and coalitions and relationships, and then that theme certainly of diversity as well. Life cycle of a board leader, we talked about that. That's a key tool. It just really provides a framework for, as an example, beginning to think about our committee and work group structure as the leadership training school for the future board. Let's talk about some of these others. So the life cycle chart, the steps. And in walking through these steps, there are a number of references to the tools that were on the previous slide. One more time, more detailed information is on the ARC. So it starts again with the strategic plan. The next step is to evaluate current board roles and structures and confirm relevancy. So we've got a committee structure, we've got a work group structure, we've figured out board size, at least up to this point. Take a fresh look and decide if there are any changes that have to be made. Once again, coming off of a strategic planning process, frequently that can be an opportunity to do some new thinking about committees, to do some new thinking about board size, some new thinking about what expectations do we list in the job descriptions for board members. So evaluate what is currently in place and confirm relevancy. Yeah, it looks like this is still going to work for us over the next couple of years. The next is to identify the competencies or skills of current leaders right now, and if we can find leaders that have had that previous experience at a committee level, odds are they're going to be a better president or vice president. And then this is where that life cycle chart comes into play. I want you to, for a moment, I want you to assume that there now is a vibrant committee and work group structure. There are task forces. There are a lot of groups doing important work. Some of them are board committees, but we have other kinds of structures in play. Lots of people there. We begin to look at that list. Again, the notion of the farm team. The notion of talent scouting. And then out of some of the leaders that show the greatest promise, I think we need to begin to actually talk to them one-on-one. We've spotted them as someone that can really go places in our association. We need to begin sharing that enthusiasm with them and see what the reaction is. Sometimes our enthusiasm is met by their enthusiasm. Wow, I'm really glad that you mentioned that because, to be honest with you, I've been wanting to be on the board of directors. I'm just not sure how you get there. In other instances, they might be surprised. You think I have leadership potential? Yeah, you really do. Well, let me think about it. Maybe we can get together and talk more. So we begin to have those conversations. So those are the steps. Let's just look at some of the tools. Oh, I also wanted to mention, with respect to item number 7, on the ARC, the Association Resource Center, and one more time, I realize I've mentioned it 5 or 6 times, the session that Richard and Mike did yesterday, it was so good. They talked about a succession planning grid, and I was able to download a copy. It's one of the best examples that I've ever come across. And take my word for it for now, but find it and study it, because it really begins to give you a picture of how we begin to really work with people that maybe aren't ready for board service yet, but they really show some promise, and we're going to have to work with them. We're going to have to really help them begin to, if they're not already thinking in terms of what are the steps that I need to take in order to develop my leadership potential, we need to help them do that. Another way of thinking about mentorship or a buddy system. Okay, so I mentioned SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, earlier. They're the organization that has put together some really excellent board succession planning tools. They've created a couple of succession grids that I think really begin to describe the process I was trying to unfold a moment ago. So in this first grid, it's pretty straightforward. 3 columns, starting over on the left, the key leadership positions. Now, when we think about leadership succession, we're thinking generally about how can we bring more new, promising leaders onto our board as board members. So we have a board member job description in mind. We're beginning to think of some prospects. And then another element of succession planning is thinking more specifically about some of the key leadership positions within the board. Some of the leader positions that are in that left column. The executive officers, and then this may not match up with your situation, but I'm just also suggesting that the chairs of some of our key committees are also top priorities for succession planning. We may have a great fundraising chair today, but there is nobody on our radar in terms of who will replace this person. And then here's another one. More columns, challenging us to look a little bit further out. A grid like this, especially if we haven't begun to develop this board succession planning process that I'm describing, a grid like this can be a bit intimidating. If you're like most of us, a lot of these cells or a lot of these spaces are going to be empty because it's just not something that we've ever done before. We haven't really thought about, okay, the chair of the fundraising committee, we know that she is going to be terming off the board in a couple of years. Who should we begin to consider? But it makes the point that if we're not able to begin to fill in those spaces, then we really do need to put some kind of a leadership succession planning process in place. Oh, you bet.
What kind of time frame are you looking at to start planning for this? Because I understand the current leader position, but when are you looking to plan for the next?
You know, I'm going to just almost off the top of my head say, begin to think in terms of the next year.
So like almost right after elections, per se? Or within like the first few months after elections?
I think within, you know, so that this process finally gets in sync with the election cycle, I would say right after the election. When are the elections?
Our annual for our board is in May. So our year starts in August like everybody else's. So our annual elections are held in May, so we could start it August then.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that might be, that sounds reasonable. You know, a couple of months to just do some internal gearing up, to get others on fire with this idea, okay? And then to just decide that by August, we're going to be able to launch the first stages of this process, and then to begin to see, remember, it's a multi-year process, but let's say in the next year, we'll be able to see some fruits of our labor, okay? Yeah. And then for a moment, and this is, I think, a key element of succession planning, let's imagine that we've been successful with succession, and we actually have new board members. A couple of things that we have to keep in mind. There was some good advice in the board orientation session yesterday. It's critical that new board members are made to feel really included as part of the board team as soon as possible. Otherwise, we risk losing them, and you've probably had this experience, successfully recruiting a younger board member, and then almost by magic, they disappeared. Speaking of younger board members, I think we need to consider generational differences. And I'll give this example. A young, new member coming onto your board, coming onto a board that has been around for a while, has an organizational culture, and I'm going to suggest that that organizational culture is an old organizational culture. Not just because those of us on the board are older chronologically, but it's the culture that built up over a number of years. And so there's going to be a natural clash. I'll give you a couple of examples. Our son, who is 30 years old today, I'm going to rush back to Milwaukee so that I can have a drink with him before the clock strikes 12. Thinking of Will and his generation, they would go crazy in a board meeting the way board meetings are typically held. Maybe, just maybe, I can get by with PowerPoint slides that have as many bullet points as my slides do. With this crowd, with Will's generation and with younger people, they would be out that door. Or they would be saying, turn that darn PowerPoint presentation off. Let's just talk. You get my drift? People, we think differently at different stages, and we have to factor those things in. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. Again, assuming that we will be successful in some of our early efforts to bring new people on. New members must be welcomed and oriented to the association culture, and the last point I was trying to make, be open to the possibility that over time, we've got to begin to transform the internal culture of our organization. So it's inclusive of our rich history as an association, but it's also welcoming and inviting to people that historically haven't been on our board. Provide new board members with clear roles and assignments. I think that starts with the job descriptions, with the committee descriptions that hopefully were used when we were recruiting them onto the board in the first place. But make sure that they get connected into the ongoing work right away. It's more than just coming to meetings. And bring new board members into the board conversation, really, exclamation point. Boards make really big decisions, and sometimes if we're not careful, again, we're not used to these new younger members or these new whatever, that we begin to deliberate on these hard issues the way we always did. It almost becomes a closed conversation of a subset of those of us that have been on the board for a long, long time. And without even being aware of it, we've left the newcomers out. And they're not going to hang around if that happens again. And then provide board mentors or buddies as an option. I mean, clearly that's not something that can be forced, but I think that people normally look to that kind of support as a really positive sign that you want me engaged. And then check in periodically with the new board members.